Hey, what's happening, Nerdtopia? Gather around, kids. The Nerdfather wants to have a little chat with you. You know, it's been about 6 months since the release of Rise of Skywalker finally closed out the tangled, garbled retcon of a mess that almost all of us would like to just put behind us and move on and focus on more important things.
Protocol droid's mind wiped.
There seems to be a small yet extremely vocal minority of people out there that are still placing all of the blame on this guy while still praising this guy. And I feel like there's plenty of blame to go around, and this guy isn't immune. I guess I've just seen it enough, and I have friends that have relentlessly posted on this topic.
Shut up! Oh my god, I don't care!
And I've held my tongue. It's finally inspired me to let this all out in one big, long-winded rant. So you can partially thank the great quarantine of 2020.
I got cabin fever!
You can partially thank my friends, and you can partially thank the writer of the article that I'm going to go over today.
I got a lot of problems with you people!
Now, listen, if you think The Last Jedi was the best part of the sequel trilogy, then fine. You're entitled to your opinion, but in the same vein, if you are one of the people who took to social media to tell people to stop whining and complaining about The Last Jedi while you are continuing to whine and complain about The Rise of Skywalker, then please have a little bit of self-awareness. If you are continuing to rail against The Rise of Skywalker because it retconned all the things you loved about The Last Jedi, and in some cases going so far as to attack the characters from the OT to fit Rian Johnson's narrative, then we're about to have a little talk. So, personally, I think that The Last Jedi was extremely insulting to fans of the OT and people who were invested in the story threads set up by The Force Awakens. Now, you could say that you hated Rise of Skywalker because it was a big convoluted mess, and I would have to agree with you. But if you don't like it simply because it retconned The Last Jedi, then be aware of the fact that Rian Johnson did it first, and when I complained about it, I was called toxic and a man-baby and was just basically told to get over it because Star Wars was moving in a bold new direction, one that I was no longer a part of.
Future's now, old man.
So recently, a friend of mine shared a few articles that didn't particularly sit well with me. Now, it's to be noted that I have great respect for this friend of mine. I've known him since my preteen years, and he and I have actually done a few podcasts together. For all intents and purposes, we get along quite well. Well, mostly. Before the dark times. Before the sequel trilogy. Now, in both of these articles he posted, I made a comment, and both times on both articles he asked me, "Did you even read the article?" Now, the second time he asked me, I finally said no. Why would I read it? I just know it's going to be a piece that actively defends The Last Jedi while attacking the rest of the sequel trilogy. And like I said, there's plenty of blame to go around here. Now, before I begin, I'd like to give credit where it's due to the author of this piece that I'm going to break down. This is a long, well-thought-out analysis of modern-day Star Wars and how it pertains to the artistic and political views of the author. She's also a published writer and obviously intelligent and serious about her political cause. While I don't agree with her views, and I will rebut them today, this is a critique and analysis of the review, not an attack on the actual author. And if you do like what she has to say, I recommend supporting her work. That being said, I'm going to go ahead and rip into this article now, because after months of seeing this crap from my friends on the opposite side of the fandom, I finally had enough, and I suppose I should thank all of the people who got me to this point, because it inspired me to launch a YouTube page where I can critique other people who give their critique. You know, like people do on the internet. So, my friend, you suggested I read the articles, and I did. I read it, analyzed it, broke it down, and here's my analysis.
Yeah, but I don't think you want it.
This is the one last straw that caused me to create this long tirade, so I give you... So here's the article that launched a YouTube page. The article comes from Medium.com, and the title of the article is Millennial Gothic, written by a published author by the name of Sarah Lyons. Granted, this article is several months old, so it isn't what I call a hot take. A cold take, maybe? Oh well, you decide. Regardless, I'm going to have a look at this and see what she has to say. Now, if you write articles, you know that the first line of the article sets the tone, and this one is no different. So, opening line.
The Star Wars sequel trilogy is fitting art for a culture that cannot let the past die.
Now, right off the bat, before even reading this, I know she's echoing Kylo Ren's tagline from The Last Jedi that many believe that Rian Johnson intentionally wrote to send a message to the fans of the original trilogy to say that
Future's now, old man.
this is the way things are now. You're going to have to let it go and get over it and move on. Right before he took to Twitter to attack the fans that weren't too happy about that creative decision. You know, come to think of it, he reminds me of somebody else who just doesn't know when to shut up on Twitter. Hey, anyways, how'd that work out for you, Ryan? Okay, buddy. Good luck with that. Anyways, a fitting art for a culture that cannot let the past die. Now, whose culture is she referring to? Is she talking about the vast majority or half the fan base here? I don't really think she's referring to her culture because off the bat, she already strikes me as something of a progressive who wants things to change. Where I'm a bit of a Star Wars traditionalist, mind you, someone who is old enough to remember seeing Return of the Jedi in theaters and fell in love with Star Wars all over again in the late 90s when the movies were re-released to theaters. We pesky original trilogy fans just won't go away, will we? We just won't let the past die. See, already I feel like she's hitting a condescending tone to those Star Wars boomers. You know, the pesky ones that actually made Star Wars profitable. She sets the tone pretty quickly, and let's read on. Oh, man. All right. Buckle in, folks. Honestly, I can't count the number of times I was told after voicing my problems with The Last Jedi, "You're taking this entirely too seriously. It's just a silly movie with laser swords." But I want to understand where she's coming from. I understand how much Star Wars means to a lot of people, and I can relate because I felt absolutely gutted after watching The Last Jedi. So I empathize with her, though I didn't necessarily feel gutted after watching Rise of Skywalker. My feelings were more along the lines of, well, thanks for trying. Because JJ attempted to repair the damage done after the insults made in the face of criticism from fans at the hands of Rian Johnson. But I recognize and I understand that she doesn't like that JJ undid Rian's work. As I said previously, I don't like that Rian undid JJ's story in progress, so I know how she feels with this sentiment.
It's a bad film, and no, I don't think that's up for debate. The plot is delirious, the pacing inconsistent.
And so far, we're in complete agreement here. I think The Rise of Skywalker was a bad film, and I won't attempt to argue that point, but take a look at what JJ had to work with. Resistance, wiped out. Central antagonist, dead. No reason or explanation or even history on who he was or his rise to power. The hero from the OT, a bitter old asshole, provided minimal guidance for Rey and her journey, and also dead. Main protagonist, fuck where she came from. You don't need to know. Expectations subverted. Finn undid his entire character arc of running from danger only to repeat his character arc again. Hell, if Ryan had any balls, he'd have just let Finn die because his arc had been done. Twice. But no, we saved him so we could get this bit of cinema gold. Yeah, we get it. I could go on, but do you not see the problem here? The second part of the trilogy is supposed to be the second act of the story. You need to carry the plot threads over and answer the questions raised in the first part in order to set up the final act. But not only did Rian Johnson toss everything aside that had been built up to this point, but he left J.J. Abrams with zero to work with. The guy, walked into a room and took a shit and cake batter, passed it to JJ and said, "Here, bake a cake for these people who are famously hard to please." And, dear God, TLJ defenders, stop saying that Ryan didn't undo The Force Awakens. The mental gymnastics that you people perform in order to absolve Ryan of guilt is truly mind-boggling to me, and I will fight you to the death if you want to debate me on this. I'm to the point where I am so tired of the Rian Johnson did nothing wrong camp that I'm giving thought to making an entirely separate video on this topic. I walked in knowing the movie was going to be like this because JJ was essentially forced to build an entire trilogy, set the stakes, answer the questions that should have been answered in the second act, raise the stakes, and then set up for an epic battle at the end in the span of one movie because everything was scrapped. Twice. And both times, Rian Johnson scrapped it. He scrapped his own story by leaving nothing at the end. He wiped the slate clean.
Meaningful plot points, character arcs, and themes from the previous two installments are almost all sacrificed on the altar of nostalgia. But there are many a film review that will tell you the same and more. You can like it, but I'm not here to debate the quality of the underlying work.
Firstly, I would ask the writer what she considers to be meaningful, but since The Last Jedi obviously held different meaning for her than it did for me, we're just gonna list that as an opinion. That's her opinion, and she's welcome to have it, but now we're equating fan service to sacrifice at the altar of nostalgia. And to that I'd ask, could you be any more dramatic? The themes from The Last Jedi are still the themes from The Last Jedi. Just like I can still enjoy Luke's journey in, say, Empire Strikes Back, it's not like TLJ defenders are trying to ruin that to fit Ryan's narrative. Yeah, that, well, maybe that'll be my next video. Anyways, I can ignore the god-awful character assassination that Luke Skywalker suffered at the hands of Rian Johnson.
Go away.
And at least he accepts some of the criticism that the fans have.
Was there any of the criticism that you read that you may feel is now kind of fair?
No.
Okay, well, never mind. Now, on to your next point. To say that many a film reviewer will tell us the same is akin to saying, reviewers agree with me. And that's a fair point, but reviewers also agree with me. For whatever point one is making, you can find people who agree and disagree with you. So let's agree that saying that people agree with me doesn't make you any more right than people disagreeing with you makes you wrong. Now, for the final statement here that she's making, she's not here to debate the quality of the underlying work, and that's fine. As I stated previously, I actually agree with her in that Rise of Skywalker is a bad film, though I think we agree for different reasons.
My feelings for this film reach beyond disappointment. As a fan, I walked in expecting to be disappointed on some level. Endings are rarely satisfactory, but the depression I sunk into after watching this movie goes a bit beyond fangirl letdown. After sitting with these feelings for a bit, I think I know the reason why.
Well, to that I'd say you and me both, sister. Although I too went in this expecting to be let down, but I don't think I left the theater with the same bitter aftertaste as her. So let's open this up and see why she felt absolutely gutted.
Now that the dust has settled, I think The Rise of Skywalker and the sequel trilogy as a whole are actually kind of perfect.
Kind of perfect? An interesting sentiment. One might say she subverted my expectations here.
Perfect at being a symbol of our culture, politics, and the art they generate.
Oh, okay. There it is. I'm going to go ahead and pump the brakes right there. Politics. There it is.
Politics is just all one big ass splash.
I'm going to take a wild swing and assume that she's pretty far to the left and TLJ reflected her politics, while Rise of Skywalker didn't attempt to push any particular political message and just tried to tell a story.
Ray Skywalker.
Well, they tried. Now, that might not be a fair assessment, so let's just go ahead and check out her website. Let's see, pulling it up here. Sarah Lyons, writer, activist, occultist, and witch. Well, okay, that's cool. Yada, yada, yada. Wrote for Vice, shocker, podcaster, and up, here we go. An organizer for the Democratic Socialists of New York City. You see, this is political for her. While The Last Jedi is a lovely dance of colorful lights and liberal themes with just a dash of anti-capitalism, which is fine if you're anti-capitalist. I'm not holding that against you. Those are your political views, but I honestly find it to be a little hypocritical since Star Wars is funded and owned by one of the biggest corporations in the world that's basically the face of modern-day capitalism.
Now, do we have a problem?
But, okay. This is just a really long-winded way of saying, I like the political messages in TLJ, but Rise of Skywalker didn't serve that same message. And this isn't just about her enjoying the message behind The Last Jedi, but it's about making sure that everyone ingests that same political bias.
As a country, we seem unable to move beyond the art or narratives of the past.
Translation. I got the political bias in my Star Wars that I wanted once, but not twice.
These films are classified within the blockbuster sci-fi fantasy genre we have become so accustomed to, but the real genre they inhabit is the Gothic, a genre that defines itself by darkness, despair, and the horrifying knowledge that the past continues to haunt us. We live in a Gothic age, and, for better or for worse, the sequel trilogy reflects this perfectly.
Okay. I'm gonna go ahead and hit the pause button again. Now, I would not consider myself an expert in Gothic lit or film.
Nevermore.
And she's obviously studied in this category, but I am pretty sure that I know the difference between the Gothic genre and modern-day science fiction/fantasy. But you don't have to take my word for it. Let's go to esteemed actor Mr. Christopher Walken with the official definition of Gothic film. Mr. Walken, the floor is yours.
The Gothic film is a film that is based on Gothic fiction or contains Gothic elements. This is various definite film genres, including science fiction, film noir, thriller, and comedy have used Gothic elements. The Gothic film is challenging to define clearly as a genre. Gothic elements have also infused the horror genre, contributing supernatural and nightmarish elements. To create a Gothic atmosphere, filmmakers have sought to create new camera tricks that challenge audiences' perceptions. Gothic films also reflected contemporary issues. A new companion to the Gothics, Heidi Kay, said, "Strong visuals, a focus on sexuality, and an emphasis on audience response characterized Gothic films like they did the literary works." The Encyclopedia of the Gothic said the foundation of Gothic film was a combination of Gothic literature, stage melodrama, and German expressionism. And the Cambridge companion to Gothic fiction, Misha Kafka, says Gothic film is not an established genre, rather contributing Gothic images, plots, characters, and styles to those films. These elements are often found in the broader category of horror. Kafka quotes William Patrick Day's definition of the Gothic: "It tantalizes us with fear both as its subjects and its effect." It does so, however, not primarily through characters or plots or even language, but the spectacle. Cinema suits the Gothic definition in creating images that establish that spectacle.
Thank you, Mr. Walken. So, let's review. Gothic film. Star Wars. Gothic film. Star Wars. Gothic film. Star Wars. Gothic film. Star Wars. You see what I mean here? Now, it's safe to assume that elements of the Gothic genre lend itself to certain visuals when the story calls for it. Yet, Star Wars is not in and of itself the Gothic, and in terms of living in the Gothic age, I honestly don't see where she's going with this, but I guess if one were, say, heavily steeped in the occult and wanted to see things that way, they could, but I don't see what... Oh. Yeah, well, there's that. Okay, so, back to how the sequel trilogy reflects living in the Gothic age.
I would love to hear this.
Trapped within the stories and politics of a previous age that no longer serves my generation, or the one after us, the sequel trilogy, and the rise of Skywalker in particular are bleak reminders of where we are at, where we could be, and, worse, where we seem to be headed.
Star Wars is the classic battle of good versus evil. There's a good force, there's a bad force, good overcomes evil. Yes, there are more themes to be found in it, but at its core, that's what Star Wars is. And the great thing about Star Wars is, as long as it remains innocuous, it can be whatever you need it to be. In fact, it's quite a timeless theme. The theme has served every generation for thousands of years. You can see the theme going back as far as storytelling itself, actually. Her issue with Rise of Skywalker isn't that the politics of the film are from a previous age. There are no politics in it. It's that the politics from The Last Jedi have been brushed aside, and the political message has been removed because it was unwanted. She's disappointed that the politics that she's so fond of were more or less shunned, and it was undone in the final film of the sequel trilogy. And as far as knowing what serves the generation after her goes, I'm going to go ahead and take that statement, and we're just going to place that to the side, because I'd like to revisit that statement later.
I dreamt last night I went to Tatooine again. Gothic literature rose to prominence in the mid to late 1700s when the...
All right, time out. This is a 3-paragraph long history of Gothic literature she's about to present us with, and let's just go ahead and hit the fast forward button here, because I think a lot of this is probably not necessary for her point. So, fast forward button. I'll see you guys for Cliff Notes at the end.
Preparing to fast forward. Fast forward. Fast forwarding, sir.
Oh, hi, you're still here. Good. So, cliff notes from this long rant. The late 1700s in Europe was a time of enlightenment, but the reminders of the past were still inescapable. She gives us a brief history of the birth of the Gothic genre, citing the book written that inspired it, the author who wrote it, and the year it was written, making the statement that the book in question was written to transport people to the past without any real tie to the past at all. She goes on to explain that the story that gave birth to the genre surrounds a family that inherits their ancestral home, but it's haunted by a family curse. She lists other Gothic lit writers that drew inspiration from the first book and claims that this theme carries over to another quote from Gothic literature. The past isn't dead. It isn't even past.
Let the past die.
Oh, yeah, okay, we get it. So, to sum up those 3 paragraphs, Gothic literature themes center around the inability to escape our past, and during the time of Enlightenment, relics of the past still littered the landscape.
So back to laser swords.
Wait a minute. Laser swords?
Jedi's weapon deserves more respect.
The landscape of the sequel trilogy is incredibly Gothic. From The Force Awakens and throughout the later films, our heroes hide in the shadow of collapsed Star Destroyers, crumbling Jedi temples, and even the ruins of the Death Star itself. Notice how little we are introduced to shimmering new worlds in the sequels. For the most part, new planets we are introduced to such as Jakku, Crate, and Exegol are all sad, decaying places no one really wants to be in. Their terrains are littered with the remnants of previous films, and most are nearly uninhabitable. The Scottish moors of space. Something important happened here once, but what are we doing here?
So, though I don't agree with her artistic interpretation, I will say that I see the parallel she's drawing and I appreciate it.
Consider the era in which these movies are being made in, and who, presumably, they are being made for. Millennials ourselves exist in the very real architectural shadow of previous, wealthier, generations. From decaying malls, to haunted McMansions, to very literally crumbling infrastructure, we find ourselves increasingly living in a world built for someone else, something else, that no longer exists as anything more than a ghost. In this way the sequels reflect perfectly the Gothic era they exist in. All the world's sequel now.
I mean, I would hope that these films are still being made for everyone. But that's the point, isn't it? She sees something that's made for everyone, and she wants them to be made for only her. Based on the behavior I've seen from Rian Johnson and the message from The Last Jedi, I'd say that the message was pretty clear. Star Wars is no longer for me unless I'm on board with this new direction they've decided to take as of late.
When I pick up your options, take a pick.
And she's right about those little bits of nostalgia having been sprinkled into a dark present. They are the last decaying bits of my childhood set there as a reminder of the greatness that once was. Her analogy would suggest that we are on the edge of enlightenment, and those little bits of the past, those annoying fans of the original trilogy, must be shed and cut loose in order to reach our full potential. Much like a caterpillar, she feels as though she's stuck in the cocoon and on the verge of some great awakening through Star Wars. And she's disappointed that we apparently took a step backwards. But what really happened is that they had to extend an olive branch and tried to bridge the gap in an ever-widening fan base. Because the people who made Star Wars aren't allowed to enjoy it anymore unless they're on board with this brand of politics. Am I getting close to the point she's making here? Because if I am, I have a single word for her.
I am the gatekeeper.
This is displayed most obviously in the final frames of The Rise of Skywalker. We see Rey return to Tatooine. Except, wait, she's not returning. This is her first time on this planet. We are returning. This is a moment meant for the audience, not the characters. This is a world meant for older generations, not younger. Rey has no connection to this place. and the connections all the original characters had to it were negative. This moment is unintentionally meta to the point of absurdity. As the final image of the trilogy, it reveals the sequels were always at best a prayer said to the great god nostalgia, and at worst a piece of art reckoning with the curse we all seem to be living under. The world we live in is ultimately not made by, or for us, and the gothic landscape of these films reflects this all too well.
Dear God, you're gonna make me defend Rise of Skywalker. Okay, here we go. Star Wars is a brand. Disney didn't just buy a franchise. They bought the recognition of a globally recognized brand. Now, I'm going to disagree with her in the fact that this is unintentionally meta. No, this was very intentional. J.J. Abrams knew exactly what he was doing with this shot. He's saying, we've come full circle now. From New Hope in 1977 to Rise of Skywalker in 2019, we've been on this journey together, all of us, for almost half a century, and now we're back home again. What one needs to understand about this is no matter what stories are told, regardless of what politics might be injected into a story, even if that political message is put ahead of the story, even if that story makes very little sense, we're always going to have those elements in the story. You know, we're all on a personal journey of our own making, and we all forge our own destiny in our own story. And while our past doesn't define who we are, you can't just kill the past. There's a very real difference between not being hindered by the mistakes of the past and letting your past define who you are and who you become.
Let the past die.
Fuck. The point I'm making here is you can't just give a middle finger to half the fan base and expect them to come back for more abuse. Because as much as one might dislike it, they need all of us. They need all of our revenue. We're going to have to unite and find common ground on this, because without our money, there might not be a Star Wars anymore.
The dead speak.
We sure did, my millennial friend. We sure did.
We live at a time where the only thing we seem capable of recycling are our bad guys. The same people who pushed the Iraq War get cushy media slots now. The people responsible for torture in that same war still have jobs, and even the baddies who brought you the Vietnam War and Iran-Contra are still kicking around.
Well, first of all, we wouldn't need to recycle good old Palps if TLJ hadn't killed the main damn villain. So, if you're pissed off about recycling villains, talk to your boy Ryan. And as far as the parallel that you're attempting to draw here regarding politicians as modern-day villains, well, it's interesting that you're wagging the finger at the generations before you, and we're going to revisit that later in this breakdown. Furthermore, I would have no idea where you're going with this. Nope. Can't see where you're going with this from a mile away. Not at all.
The past and our inability to move beyond it are reflected in Gothic fiction not just through landscape and setting, but through characters and, often, supernatural beings such as ghosts, vampires, and demons who have lived through centuries to be with us today. This is one of the bleaker ways the sequel trilogy is not just Gothic in its own right, but reflects the Gothic nature of the age it was made in. Nothing seems new anymore, no new stories, characters, and certainly no conclusions. All of our political scandals and dramas are merely recycled tropes and plots of a different age.
Once again, this apparent Gothic age that we're living in is simply her artistic interpretation of the times and these films. I won't attempt to argue her vision, not now, anyways, but I would, however, like to suggest two very simple truths. One, Hollywood isn't out of new ideas so much as they are just betting on brand recognition over new ideas. Disney spent $4 billion on this one, so as long as they can squeeze money out of this cash cow, Star Wars is pretty much here until the end of time, which, judging by the way this year is going, about 2 more weeks.
The end is near! We are all gonna die!
Secondly, our political scandals repeating is just simply history repeating itself. It's a tried and true statement.
It's not the recycling of old characters from the original trilogy that makes these movies gothic, but the way in which it is often done, especially in Skywalker. Where there is heart and the right level of nostalgia in the first two films, by the end all our favorites from the original trilogy are brought back in ways that span from weary to ghoulish. I mean, they basically had Carrie Fisher's reanimated corpse walking around for half of the final film.
Now here, I would ask her, what nostalgia from The Last Jedi is she referring to? Did we watch separate films? Our OT hero is a dried-up, bitter old shell of his past self, sacrificed so that Rey can be better by comparison. By her own admission in this article, she recognizes that TLJ is a nostalgia killer. So when she says that it had the right amount of nostalgia, I'm going to assume that she meant none at all, or else she's contradicting herself. And yeah, I'm not going to disagree with her in that parading Carrie Fisher around the screen after her death wasn't creepy. But come on, they blew the dust off of Peter Cushing's 22-year-old decaying corpse to march him out for Rogue One, so yeah, let's not pretend that they're beyond that.
Palpatine returning isn't quite as dramatic or disturbing as the ex-wife in the attic in Jane Eyre.
Yes, she reads classic literature, we get it.
But it's functionally the same. When heroes return, it's curious why we still need them at all. Nothing Lando, Leia, or even Han do things that a new character couldn't do. Without going too far into script doctoring, is it possible that Rose could have rallied the galaxy, and Kylo Ren could have redeemed himself through his own actions? Perhaps Rey's power could have been her own, instead of a result of genetics?
Oh man, you're serious.
Let me laugh even harder.
Okay, well, first of all, we knew that this was not going to be Luke Skywalker's story, and we were fine with that. He was the Obi-Wan or the Yoda. We knew that, but at the time The Force Awakens came out, we openly welcomed Rey. She was probably a bit overpowered, mind you, but since her heritage was so much of a mystery, where she came from was the only logical explanation as to why she could do the things she could do with no training at all, which is why fans took to the internet to cook up their own fan theories. That means that we were invested. We were invested in this character, and Rian Johnson pissed on our investment. And then he gloated about it. And for God's sakes, all we wanted to see was a few of our favorites back in action, but they were meticulously killed off one by one. But when some legacy characters show up and do a few things in the name of fan service and Rise of Skywalker, she pouts and asks why it couldn't have been Rose Tico. So I'm going to lay a truth bomb on you, Rose fans, and it's not going to be a pleasant one. Rose Tico just was not well liked by the fans, and first of all, I'm not talking about the misogynist, racist assholes who harassed her on social media. Like, seriously, fuck those people. I think Kelly Marie Tran is a beautiful, talented woman, and she deserved a lot better than what she got. That being said, the character was shoehorned into the story. The Canto Bight side plot that she took part in was nonsense and wasted precious screen time. And she delivered the stupidest line delivered in Star Wars history.
I'll try spinning. That's a good trick.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
Yeah, worse than that one.
Saving what we love.
BT Dubs, exactly how many hugs does it take to defeat the First Order? Just question for reasons. By the way, nobody complained in Episode 2 when Jar Jar Binks suddenly vanished, so where was the outrage then? And then, for that matter, where was the outrage when Ahmed Best was attacked by racist fans for portraying the character that nobody liked? For that matter, Why did nobody argue over the genius of The Phantom Menace? It just seemed to be a universally disliked film. So to this, I would ask her why Rose Tico deserved to be a player in Episode 9, and I'd ask her to tell me without using the terms diversity or strong female character. For some reason unknown to me, I can say General Hux was a fuck-up, and nobody will bat an eye. But if I say Holdo was a fuck-up, everyone loses their minds.
You have bet the survival of the Resistance on bad odds and put us all at risk?
Some Holdo maneuvers. Do some real damage.
Come on, that move is 1 in a million.
There is toxicity on both sides of this fandom, I can assure you. And as far as Kylo being redeemed through his own actions, I don't even feel like he deserved the arc he was given. And if he was going to turn, he should have done so after killing Snoke in The Last Jedi. But no, we're going to have him do that in the third act for reasons. So there you have that. And to answer your question, could Rey's power have been her own? There has to be some kind of explanation as to why she was able to defeat a Dark Jedi in Episode 7, pop off mind tricks on her second attempt, when this is a power that requires years of training, and explain how, after 5 minutes of training, she's able to do this. I'm sorry, I even feel that Palpatine being her grandfather was a weak explanation given everything that she was able to do with no training, but for God's sakes, Anakin Skywalker was birthed by the Force, the child of prophecy, the chosen one. Well, before the retcon anyways. And all he could do on his first appearance is compete in a glorified desert go-kart race. So what other reason would you have that power be her own? That's been her problem from the beginning. She never earned any of these powers or any of these abilities. She never made any mistakes like a hero is supposed to. Yeah, we'll get to that one too, don't worry.
About that last point, the mid-series revelation that Rey is no one, that she comes from nowhere and has no place in this story, forced her character, so we thought, to confront herself head-on and forge a new destiny on her own. It's a coming-of-age story not just for her, but for the generation growing up with a new set of heroes. This is what makes this particular change to a crucial plot point in Skywalker so depressing. By making Rey someone, a Palpatine to be exact, from a family of someones, it not only robs a female character of her agency and power by relating it all back to a man, but moreover it robs the young of their power by relating it back to the old.
Look, I agree with her in that making Rey a Palpatine was a stupid decision, and there's better routes that they could have chosen, but there's also an alternative view to this, and it's the one that I think JJ was trying to make. That, believe it or not, ties in with the theme that Rian Johnson was trying to illustrate.
Let the past die.
Yeah, we get it. Making her a Palpatine shows that it doesn't matter where you come from, what your family history was, or even where you get your power. She took that power, reformed it, and turned it into something better. God, I'm defending Rise of Skywalker. Look, you make your own path in life, and you don't have to be weighed down by your past. Shut up. Letting the past die doesn't mean forget the past. It means not being held back by it. She's not who she is because she was born a Palpatine, nor because she worked with Leia in the Resistance. She's who she is because of the choices she made for herself, not for the choices that were made for her. Because of the choices that she independently chose to make. Not only does it show that Rey isn't trapped by her lineage and her own choices to take control of her own destiny, but it ultimately empowers her by breaking a cycle of seemingly predestined actions by previous Jedi and Sith as she becomes neither, transcending the traditional roles and legacies of both to stand tall, the first of a new line of which all future generations will be able to trace themselves back to. Don't get me wrong, Rise of Skywalker is still a muddled, inconsistent film. The point is, it's your choice to make. You can look at Rey and see a character whose power is attributed to an evil man, or you can look at her and see a hero who chose to become something greater than what she once was. That interpretation is up to you, and the choice is yours. You can curse the generations past and try to forget them and their mistakes, or you can learn from them, grow from them, and become something greater than what you are now.
It's not just that old heroes and villains are back, it's that they are back despite their usefulness, or lack thereof. The series essentially concludes with the thesis that the young and new cannot stand on our own, that, for some reason, we need the counsel of older and wiser voices to sanctify our choices, guide our choices, or just make our choices for us. It's a good thing our political leadership is so young, or this would all start to hit a little too close to home.
There was once a time, a long time ago, when the oldest were the most respected. The people who had lived longer had more experience than you. They had wisdom to give you in which to guide you. This is absolutely reflected time and time again in cinema and storytelling. Obi-Wan learned from Qui-Gon. Luke learned from Obi-Wan and Yoda, and Rey, well, Rey was apparently powerful enough to do this, and this, with minimal guidance. Hell, she was able to best Luke Skywalker in combat with almost no training, and the only time she ever really called upon the help from the voices of the past was while facing down the most powerful Sith in the galaxy. And they didn't even intervene. Well, apparently they could have, but that's a grumble for another day, yeah? Now, I understand that to the writer, young leaders equals better, more inspired, competent, and capable, but it doesn't always. Young people tend to share her views, and ultimately that's the only thing I think the author really cares about is living in an echo chamber. As a millennial, she may be quick to dismiss the words of her elders, but remember her earlier words about what best serves the generation after her? She already thinks she knows better than what the generation after hers will need, but yet the voices of the generation before her serves no purpose. You know, the boomers did the exact same thing that she is doing right now, and man, what a rude awakening she's going to be in for when the generation after her comes of age and utters the phrase, "Whatever, millennial." Trust me, this concept of thinking that the generation before you messed it up and left a mess for you to clean up is not a new concept. I promise this will come full circle, and she will be the one who will be told to be silent. My generation is not special. The boomers are not special. And most importantly,
you are not special. You are not a beautiful or unique snowflake.
This has all happened before, and it'll all happen again. In today's climate, it's easy to focus on our differences rather than what brings us together. Even those annoying boomers that you may dislike so much may have a shred of wisdom, and there's nothing wrong with going to your elders for advice and counsel when you feel you need it. But still, I can't help wondering where she's going with this.
The new Star Wars films in general seem intent on undoing death on every level. From bringing back old characters in the flesh to reanimating their G-corpses long past their expiration date, it seems like we may never be allowed to move on, to forge new legends and icons of our own. In strange eons, even death may die. Was this what the sequels were always going to be? Was this new franchise always doomed to reflect back the horrifying confinement of our time? Could things have been different? It's time we talk about The Last Jedi.
All right, everyone, let's prepare to kneel at the temple of Rian Johnson.
I'll never kneel to you!
The Force Ghost of the Opera. I have held off talking about this film until now because it is in many ways the most overtly gothic film not just in the sequel trilogy, but perhaps the franchise as a whole. But if we are talking about the past, family legacy, and lost grandeur that cripples future generations, The Last Jedi gives us this and more in spades. It is one of the more gothic films of its age and genre, and the reaction to it speaks, in part, to how uncomfortable a truth that is for many to hear.
Yeah, but this still isn't a gothic film that you're talking about. It just lends itself to gothic themes, which doesn't make a gothic film. I mean, her point isn't lost on me, but can we stop calling Star Wars gothic?
While the Hot Take Factory certainly had a field day with this movie when it came out, I suspect this will be the film of the sequel trilogy history will be kindest to.
Will it, though?
This rests not just on The Last Jedi's technical, narrative, or artistic strengths, all of which it has, but also on the context in which it was made.
Okay, so I'll give her this. The Last Jedi is visually a brilliant film, but the narrative was a garbled mess. Like, the narrative was only slightly better than Rise of Skywalker, and I'm being generous. And if any of the TLJ defenders really want to go toe-to-toe on this, come at me, bro. I mean, this video is long enough as is, and the context in which it was made? Oh, man. You mean... Oh, boy.
The Last Jedi attempts many bold things, both as a Star Wars film and as a big-budget sci-fi film in general. It follows the pattern of the original series, being the dark, central turning point, while also attempting to break new ground. The film democratizes the Force out of bloodlines, presents heroes capable of extreme failure, and attempts to tear down a worship of nostalgia, while still keeping true to the themes of the original trilogy, beyond being different for difference sake.
Was it though?
The Last Jedi cares a great deal more about telling a compelling story, deepening narrative themes, and speaking to the hopes and fears of the generation it is made for than anything else. The same cannot be said for The Rise of Skywalker or The Force Awakens.
This, honestly, I can't see it being anything more than the writer's political bias. When she says that TLJ cared about telling deepening narrative themes and speaking to the hopes and fears of the generation, what is she referring to? What hopes, what fears exactly? She's being so vague that she could literally find any theme here and shape it to fit her narrative, which is basically what she's doing.
So what makes it gothic in the classic sense? Is it the muted palette or the amount of death in the film? Is it the young female protagonist and her questionable relationship with the dark, brooding villain? Is it the many descents into darkness, or the overwhelming imprisonment of past failures?
Is not love not unlike the unlikely not it is unlikened to?
Yes, it's all of these reasons, but it's also the fact that The Last Jedi seems to be the only Star Wars sequel, and maybe the only post-Q era film to feel very aware of the gothic age it grows out of.
And again, for the third or fourth time, this is an artistic interpretation. Stating it over and over again doesn't make it true.
Lines like Luke declaring it's time for the Jedi to end and Kylo Ren's plea for Rey to let go within an already very meta-textual film wink at the audience that we aren't just talking about space. Conflicts here. The Last Jedi seems to know it exists in a world that is unsustainable and threatens to collapse under its own weight unless some drastic changes are made soon.
Yeah, let's talk about that line, it's time for the Jedi to end. Actually, you know what? I won't even do it. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Mark Hamill.
Who is this guy? How did the most optimistic, hopeful character in the galaxy turn into this hermit who says it's time for the Jedi to end? I read that and I said, what? I mean, that's not what a Jedi does. I mean, a Jedi is optimistic. A Jedi has tenacity. He never gives up. He doesn't secrete himself on an island.
And I think it's just because the attitude of tossing on the go worked really well. So
That wasn't just a wink to Ryan's following. It was a middle finger to the work of George Lucas. The Jedi were defenders of the weak. They were the guardians of the galaxy. Nope, wrong Guardians of the Galaxy. Your assessment that Star Wars is going to collapse unless changes are made, it would collapse if changes continue, because divisive politics will be what destroys this franchise, mark my words. And it's funny that you mentioned the MCU, because if you take a moment and look into the world of comic books from which it was spawned, those politics are destroying the very thing that they're being injected into.
We could talk about the climate that this film was conceived in, that of the Trump era.
We did it! Oh my god. We finally did it. We circled Star Wars back around to Trump. Congratulations. Knew you could do it. Proud of you, kid. Didn't see it coming.
And a fragmented and often failing left countering a global uptick in very real fascism, but unfortunately for our heroes, TLJ mostly fits into this analysis because of the way its legacy was undone.
What fascism are you referring to? You know what? I'm just gonna stay off of politics as much as I can here. Let's just move on.
J.J. Abrams so desperately didn't want The Last Jedi to matter. It's this retconning of the previous, and far superior, film that gets to the heart of what makes The Rise of Skywalker such a cynical piece of media. And when that hits all too close to home with current events.
All right, let's do this one last time.
Okay. It did not matter what JJ wanted. His job was to extend this olive branch to the fans that Rian Johnson pissed off. And it wasn't enough that he set out to make a divisive film, but he took to interviews and social media to attack the people who criticized his work. It's as easy as this. If you're selling a product, you do not spit in the face of the people who complain about the product and then demand their money. Ryan obviously thought he was bulletproof, and he could hide from criticism behind his fans and sweeping blanket attacks of sexism and toxicity. He thought that as long as they were selling the product Star Wars, he could insult, belittle, and bully, and the product would just sell by sheer virtue of being called Star Wars. Personally, I don't think that Bob Iger cared what political agendas were placed in the film so long as it didn't hurt his $4 billion investment, but guess what? It did. Star Wars is not bulletproof. You cannot slap someone and then demand they buy something. People will walk away, even if it is a brand as beloved as Star Wars. Rian Johnson took to Twitter when he should have been silent. He berated fans, and by fans, I mean customers. You know how when people antagonize trolls on Twitter? Yeah, I don't like it either. Rian Johnson did this. And if you were in his camp, clapping and helping him to bat the hornet's nest and cheering him on, then guess what? You're partially responsible for what happened. Bob Iger's bottom line suffered. Rian Johnson and his lack of diplomacy are the reason everyone saw the retconning of what she refers to as a superior film. J.J. Abrams was almost certainly tasked by Disney to try to bury the hatchet. Now, there are a lot of politics in Hollywood that go beyond what's happening in D.C., and most of them have to do with making a film profitable. So if you're a TLJ defender and you need someone to blame for this, look in the mirror.
Consider how fitting it is that President Donald Trump was impeached the day before The Rise of Skywalker was set to be released. This, historically, politically, culturally should matter, shouldn't it? And yet, don't you have a sinking suspicion it won't?
Must we connect Star Wars to Trump?
And consider also the crop of current Democratic frontrunners. Some, most notably Joe Biden, are running explicitly on making the last 8 years feel like they didn't happen, assuring donors that nothing will fundamentally change if he is elected. There is a sizable amount of people who don't actually want to confront Trump or the political reality he represents. They would rather pretend this past 8 years was a dark movie they didn't care for, one that can be rewritten with a new administration filled with beloved older characters. Don't worry, just eat your popcorn.
She is trying desperately to draw connections between the political arena of today and the retconning of The Last Jedi. Because for her, it is not only necessary to get her political message from Star Wars, but the insistence that we all take it and like it. From something that was built from the generation before hers, she is now saying, this is mine now. Not ours, mine. She wants to take something and change it, shape it, mold it into something that it isn't. It never was. This is the way it is now, and if we don't like it, we should leave, and that's fine. Honestly, I was fully prepared to walk away after TLJ and leave it to her and people who enjoyed the direction it was going, if that's the way Star Wars was headed. But the sad fact is, this train doesn't run without everyone on board. You can't have your cake and eat it too. Politics simply does not belong in Star Wars. But Star Wars has always been political. Okay. We're gonna put this one to bed once and for all. The original trilogy had themes that everyone could get behind. Nazis are bad. Tyranny is bad. And no, we are not living in a tyrannical dictatorship currently. The point is that the themes were once simple. And if you argue that Star Wars has always been political, then I would ask you why Star Wars has only become divisive since The Last Jedi. Moreover, I would ask why all fans seem to enjoy The Mandalorian and why those toxic fans aren't bitching about it. Oh, well, I guess some of those toxic fans are.
I'll lay my cards squarely on the table and admit that The Last Jedi is not just my favorite film of the new trilogy, but my favorite Star Wars film overall. It is this film's shameless retconning and disregard that makes The Rise of Skywalker feel very pessimistic to me.
Yeah, well, you know what I find pessimistic? Using politics to divide a fan base of something that used to bring us all together, but hey, that's just me.
So, it is fitting that this movie speaks, even aesthetically, most directly to the Gothicism of our age, and it is the one done the most dirty and treated the most controversially of the new trilogy. From its tortured heroes, to its Byronic villains, to the crushing, suffocating past that our characters run from and are ensnared by again and again. The Last Jedi tells us that letting go of the familiar past is scary, moving into an uncertain future without family or legacy to guide you is scary, but it is what we all must do. The film's thesis can be summed up by Kylo Ren's plea to Rey: let the past die, kill it, if you have to. It's the only way to become what you were meant to be. But we can't, can we? Or at least that's what the sequels seem intent on saying. In politics, and in art, we are a culture that cannot seem to let the last die.
I would take a moment to remind the author and to remind all of you that these are words uttered by a practitioner of the dark side of the Force. You know, the power that draws its source from anger, greed, hatred, and in some cases, entitlement.
That lightsaber, it belongs to me.
Kylo Ren was a murderer who led a dictatorial regime. Is he really the character that you'd like to get your message from? The guy who murdered his loving father in cold blood and almost murdered his mother? Had epic temper tantrum and anger issues and tortured people to get what he wanted? Again, letting the past die doesn't mean to forget. And that was the problem with The Last Jedi. It's not that we didn't want something new. It's just that we wanted to see the old respected as we move forward. It's not about living in the past. It's about remembering where you came from.
The Fall of the House of Skywalker. I wish I could offer up a satisfying conclusion to all this, But much like these films, I don't know where we go from here. Works of Gothic fiction are always trying to tell us about the discomforts and fears of the time they exist in, so if this trilogy is truly Gothic, what are we scared of? What are we running from? And are we simply running to the peace and safety of a new, dark age? There is a scene in The Last Jedi where Rey descends into a cave to confront her dark side. The motif of the descent into darkness is perhaps the most commonly used trope across Gothic fiction. Rey may not be carrying a candelabra and wearing a nightgown, but her journey is the same of the Gothic heroines that came before. While in this cave, she sees herself, endless and alone. This scene confused me when I first saw it, but subsequent rewatches have given me a new appreciation for it.
I'm going to go ahead and stop her here as she's wrapping up because I've entertained this notion from the beginning. I've said several times that I appreciate her artistic interpretation, but her interpretation is just that, an interpretation. But she does not present it as such. She presents it as fact. That Star Wars is of the Gothic genre, and her arguments that we are being haunted by the brand of nostalgia, and because of this, we are unable to move on and reach our potential enlightenment. She also spent a good amount of time attempting to tie this into the modern state of politics because reasons. And honestly, I respect her for this. She's trying to bolster a cause that she believes in, but falls short of being able to tie these two things together. The author is obviously educated on the Gothic genre and tropes within that genre. We know this because she spent several paragraphs giving us an education on the history of Gothic literature. But like so many fresh-faced college grads I've met, she's all too eager to share the knowledge that she's learned with the world, whether the application of it be practical or not. You see, knowledge is important, and she has it in spades, but application of that knowledge more so. Firstly, I'm going to say this. Descending into the darkness is a common theme throughout all of literature, and it's not a Gothic trope. This goes back as far as storytelling itself. In fact, it's a common theme of the hero's journey, commonly called the belly of the whale. The hero usually undergoes this stage during the second act of the journey. The belly of the whale represents the final separation from the hero's known world and self. By entering this stage, the hero shows willingness to undergo a metamorphosis. During this stage of the hero's journey, the hero becomes consumed with the darkness and destroys their former self, emerging forever changed and prepared to move on to the next phase of the journey. Secondly, if you'll indulge me, I'm going to take a page out of her playbook and use a classic story from Gothic literature to illustrate my views on the current state of Star Wars. I'll draw your attention to the picture of Dorian Gray, a Gothic novel written by Oscar Wilde in 1890. Dorian Gray is a greatly desired man who inspires a painter to capture his own beauty on canvas. Being a narcissist, he is overwhelmed with fear of losing his beauty. So he sells his soul for a dark enchantment to be placed upon the painting and himself, prompting the painting to age rather than him. As time goes on, his actions become more and more self-serving, and his obsession with his beauty grows. But for every indecent act he commits, the painting bears the scars of age and his own selfishness. His actions indirectly cause death and despair. He locks the painting away so that the truth cannot be seen by others or by himself. When confronted by the painter who created the portrait, his obsession causes him to fly into a frenzy, and he commits murder. The story ends as Dorian attempts to silence the crushing weight of his own conscience by destroying the painting, using the same knife he used to murder the artist that painted it. He is found dead with the knife plunged into his own heart, his corpse aged, hideous, and unrecognizable. This is, of course, a simplistic summary of the story and does not begin to touch on all of the plot points or themes, but if I wanted to, I could easily launch into a full comparison about Star Wars selling its soul, so that it would not age and remain timeless, and how that deal brought about its own selfishness and how it finally collapsed under the weight of the legacy it built. Now, do I agree with that artistic interpretation? No, I don't. But could I build a full and in-depth comparison drawing on these two parallels? Absolutely. The point I'm making here is interpretation is just that. It's an interpretation, and it's neither right or wrong. It's just one person's view.
As we leave one decade behind and wander into the next, we know we cannot return to the past, and we know horrors await us in the future. We know, also, as the early critics of the Enlightenment did, that the world is a fundamentally unknowable place, and we must head into the darkness without knowing what we may find, if anything at all. Confronting who and what we are, on a personal and collective level, when removed from the pain and glory of the past, is something we all must do. It might be frightening to see ourselves standing alone, but we must take heart from this, because that actually might be enough. We actually might not need the blessings or stories of previous generations in order to move forward. In fact, we probably don't. Our stories have served us this long, but I think it's perhaps time we start telling new ones. Maybe if we do, we'll get newer and better movies as well.
And so this very long article comes to an end. And I have to say, she obviously put a lot of time into it and knows her stuff on this topic. She's obviously an artist and an activist, and Star Wars means a lot to her, just as it does for me. And I'm going to echo the very same words that she said. I actually think it's kind of perfect. Perfect because it really does showcase the worst of this side of the fandom, and unfortunately of Rian Johnson's filmmaking style. You can't just take something that millions around the world love, mix your own message into it, and expect everyone to fall in line. Now, if you want that, there's plenty of books, movies, and television that are doing this already, but Star Wars is not a political platform. I'm sorry, but it's not. It's something universal, something that everyone should be able to get behind. And if you go into Star Wars, or anything for that matter, with the intent of dividing people, then you're no longer creating something that everyone can enjoy. It's like putting nuts in a batch of brownies, even when you know half the people in your house don't like nuts. It's self-serving, and unfortunately seems to be the mentality of this article. You know, once Star Wars was a thing that united us. It didn't matter what side of the aisle you were on, it was just something that everyone could get behind. It was fun. It was pure, and the things we argued about were things like, how far is the Kessel Run? What happened in the last fight between Obi-Wan and Anakin before they met on the Death Star, and what made a lightsaber work, and what was the name of the Cantina band and that song they sang. We speculated, we laughed, we bonded. The good guys wore white hats and the bad guys wore black masks. We want to share our love of that galaxy far, far away with you, but the problem is trying to make things relevant to today's political climate. Not only does it divide us, but it makes it dated. It no longer stands the test of time. The sequel trilogy may be remembered, but only because it bore the name Star Wars, the timeless name that was established almost 50 years ago. And in today's world, aren't we fighting over enough things? Can't we just leave the things that unite us well enough alone? And if Star Wars was pushing a conservative message, wouldn't it bother you? I personally long for a day that we can set aside our differences and just enjoy a good adventure story. We can do better. I hope we can do better. You don't have to push our bias on everyone. Create films without divisiveness. Films where we don't have to put a political stamp or message over the priority of just telling a good story. Maybe we'll get there again someday. The Rise of Skywalker, for all its faults and fan service, was really just trying to do one thing. Bridge the ever-widening gap between my side of the fandom and yours. Because, as I said earlier, we've got to unite. We've got to find common ground, because if we don't, this ship will sink.
And I'm not just talking about Star Wars. I mean, in life, too.
Anyways, it's just something to think about. Thanks for nerding out with me, guys. Have a good night. All right, and that is that. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end. I know that was a lengthy video. My other videos will most likely not be this long unless I have a lot to say on something. And not every video is going to be me trashing something like I did this time around. We're going to do a lot of things. I'm going to offer some praise, and we're going to have some fun on this channel. So, once again, thanks for sticking around. Please drop a like and please subscribe. I'd love to see you guys back here in the future, and I'll see you next time. Thanks, guys.
Any of the criticisms that you read that you may feel is now kind of fair?
No.